They say money can't buy class, but it can certainly buy silence. In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, Julian Thorne thought he was untouchable. He thought his pregnant wife, Jake, was just a trophy he could tarnish whenever he got bored. He thought letting his mistress humiliate her in front of 50 guests was a power move. But Julian made one critical mistake. He forgot to check who Jake's family really was. He didn't know that the man coming to dinner wasn't just a brother. He was the kind of monster that nightmares are afraid of. This is the story of how a billionaire learned the price of disrespect. The chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Thorne estate was worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yet it cast a cold, unforgiving light on Jake. She stood near the periphery of the room, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen stomach. She was 8 months pregnant, her ankles throbbing in heels that Julian insisted she wear because flats look lazy. The gala was ostensibly for Julian's charity foundation, something about clean water that served mostly to launder his reputation, but everyone knew it was just another stage for Julian Thorne to preen. He stood in the center of the room, holding court. He was handsome in that sharp, predatory way. Tall, impeccable tuxedo, eyes that smiled without ever reaching the soul. Clinging to his arm wasn't Jake. It was Sienna. Sienna was everything Jake currently wasn't. Sleek, dangerous, and poured into a crimson dress that left little to the imagination. She was the worst-kept secret in New York. Julian didn't even try to hide her anymore. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the juxtaposition, his dutiful, heavy wife in the corner, and his fiery mistress on his arm. "Jake!" Julian's voice cut through the ambient chatter. It wasn't a loving summons, it was a command. The conversation in the room lulled. The guests, bankers, tech moguls, and social climbers, turned their eyes toward her. Jake felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She waddled slightly as she approached, the weight of the baby making her movements slow and labored. "Yes, Julian?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Sienna's glass is empty," Julian said, his voice booming with a jovial cruelty. He gestured to the bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux sitting on the heavy oak table near Jake. "Be a dear and top her off. The servers are busy." A hush fell over the room. It was a deliberate humiliation. The servers weren't busy. 3 of them were standing idly by the wall. Julian wanted her to do it. He wanted the mother of his child to serve his mistress. Jake looked at him, pleading silently with her eyes. "Please, not here. Not in front of them." Julian's smile tightened. "Now, Jake, don't be difficult." Trembling, Jake reached for the heavy bottle. Her hands were swollen from the pregnancy, her grip unsure. She walked over to where Sienna stood, smirking like a cat who had cornered a mouse. "Careful, honey," Sienna cooed, extending her crystal glass. "Don't strain yourself." Jake poured. Her hand shook, the dark liquid swirling into the glass. She stopped when it was full, exhaling a breath she didn't know she was holding. She started to pull away. "Oops," Sienna said. It happened in slow motion. Sienna didn't trip. She didn't stumble. She simply flicked her wrist. The wine launched from the glass, a dark red arc that splashed violently across Jake's chest and stomach. The cold liquid soaked instantly into her white silk maternity gown, looking horrifyingly like fresh blood. Jake gasped, dropping the heavy bottle. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You clumsy cow!" Julian roared. He wasn't yelling at Sienna. He was yelling at Jake. "Look what you've done!" Julian stepped forward, grabbing Jake's arm hard enough to bruise. "That was a $3,000 bottle of wine, and you threw it on the floor because you're jealous?" She threw it," Jake stammered, tears welling in her eyes. The sticky wine was cold against her skin, seeping through to her belly. "Oh, please." Sienna laughed, dabbing at a microscopic drop on her own dress. "Julian, she practically threw it at me. She's hysterical. It's the hormones." The crowd murmured. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody offered a napkin. They were all too afraid of Julian Thorne's influence, or perhaps they just enjoyed the spectacle of a wife being broken in real time. "Go upstairs," Julian hissed, leaning into Jake's ear, his grip tightening. "Get out of my sight. You look disgusting." Jake pulled her arm free, a sob escaping her throat. She turned and fled the ballroom as fast as her body would allow, the sound of Sienna's laughter and Julian's apologies to the guests following her all the way to the grand staircase. As she climbed the stairs, one agonizing step at a time, she heard Julian's voice booming below. "Apologies, everyone. My wife is having a difficult pregnancy, a little unstable. Let's not let it ruin the night." Jake reached the landing and collapsed against the wall, clutching her stomach. She felt a sharp cramp. "Not yet," she whispered to her unborn child. "Please, not yet." She looked down at the red stain covering her child. It looked like a target, and for the first time in years, the fear that usually paralyzed her was replaced by something else. Rage. The master bedroom was a testament to Julian's ego, minimalist, cold, and devoid of comfort. Jake stripped off the ruined dress, shivering as the air conditioning blasted against her wet skin. She stood in front of the vanity mirror. She looked at the woman reflected there. Dark circles under her eyes, pale skin, a spirit seemingly crushed. 3 years. That's how long it had been since she married Julian. She had met him when she was an art student in Paris. He was the dashing American investor. She was the quiet girl sketching in the Louvre. He had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and promises of a fairy tale. But the fairy tale had rotted quickly. Julian didn't want a partner. He wanted a possession. He systematically isolated her. First, he convinced her that her friends were jealous of her new wealth. Then he moved her to New York, thousands of miles from her family in Europe. He never asked much about her family. To Julian, the Vissers were just nobodies from a small town near the German-Dutch border. He knew she had a brother, Nikolai, but Julian had laughed when she mentioned him. A logistics manager? Julian had scoffed during their first year of marriage. So, a truck driver. Cute. Don't worry, Jake. You're a thorn now. You don't need those peasants. Jake had stopped mentioning Nikolai. She stopped calling home, ashamed of the bruises on her arms and the sadness in her voice. She didn't want Nikolai to know. Because Julian was wrong about Nikolai. He wasn't a truck driver. And logistics was a very broad term for what the Visser family actually did. Jake walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower, scrubbing the wine off her skin until it turned red from the heat. The cramps were subsiding, but the humiliation burned hotter than the water. She wrapped herself in a robe and sat on the edge of the bed. Downstairs, the music was thumping. She could hear the muffled sounds of laughter. They were celebrating her absence. The door to the bedroom flew open. Julian stumbled in, smelling of brandy and Sienna's perfume. He loosened his tie, glaring at her. "You embarrassed me," he slurred, pointing a finger at her. "Do you know who was there? The senator, the entire board of directors, and you stand there dripping like a wounded animal." "She poured it on me, Julian," Jake said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I don't care," Julian shouted, kicking a chair. "Even if she did, you take it. You smile and you take it. That is your job. I pay for the clothes on your back, the food in your mouth, and the roof over your head. You exist because I allow it." He walked over to the nightstand, grabbed her phone, and tossed it onto the bed. "Sienna is staying the night," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "In the guest wing. But I don't want you wandering around. You stay in this room until I say otherwise. If you come downstairs, if you make a sound, I will cut off your credit cards. I will make sure you end up on the street with that brat in your belly. Do you understand?" Jake looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the weakness behind the bluster. She saw a man who thought money was the only currency in the world. "I understand," she said softly. "Good," Julian sneered. "I'm going back to the party. Try not to ruin anything else tonight." He slammed the door. She heard the distinct click of the lock from the outside. He had locked her in. Jake sat in silence for a long time. The house was smart-wired. He could track her calls, her texts. He monitored everything. But Julian was arrogant. He thought he knew everything about technology, but he didn't know about the burner phone Jake had taped behind the heavy velvet headboard of the bed 6 months ago. A fail-safe she had hoped never to use. She reached behind the headboard, her fingers trembling until she felt the cool plastic. She pulled it out. It had 15% battery left. She didn't call the police. The police in this precinct played golf with Julian. They would just call him, and he would spin a story about his hysterical, pregnant wife. No. She needed a different kind of help. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang once, twice. "Yeah?" A deep, gravelly voice answered. It was sharp, alert, despite the time difference. Jake let out a sob she couldn't hold back. "Nico?" There was a silence on the other end. A heavy, loaded silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping back as if someone had stood up very quickly. "Jake?" His voice changed. The hardness evaporated, replaced by an intense, terrifying focus. "Jake, why are you whispering? Where have you been?" I messed up, Nico. You were right. You were right about him. Is he hurting you?" The question was not emotional. It was a tactical assessment. "He locked me in the room. His mistress poured wine on me in front of everyone, and he laughed. He said I exist because he allows it." "Are you pregnant?" Nikolai asked. He must have heard the breathlessness in her voice, or perhaps family intuition. "Yes. 8 months. It's a boy, Nico." "And he is mistreating you while you carry my nephew?" "Yes." "Where are you?" "The estate in the Hamptons. But Nico, you can't just come here. He has security. He has the police in his pocket. He's powerful." Nikolai let out a low, dark laugh. It was a sound that made the hairs on Jake's arms stand up. It was the sound of a wolf being told that a sheep thinks it's in charge. "Jake, listen to me carefully. Do you have food? Water?" "Yes, in the ensuite. There's a mini-fridge." "Good. Stay in that room. Lock the door from the inside if you can. Do not open it for him. Do not open it for anyone but me." "When will you be here?" Jake asked, looking at the clock. It was 11 p.m. in New York. Nikolai was in Hamburg. It would take a day, maybe more. "I am currently in London," Nikolai said. "I will be there in 6 hours." 6 hours? That's impossible. The flight alone. "I am not flying commercial, Mafia. Stay put. And Jake?" "Yes." "When I get there." "Look away." The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone. She remembered growing up, seeing men in suits coming to talk to her father and brother in hushed tones. She remembered the respect they commanded in the village. She remembered the time a boy had bullied her in school, and the next day, that boy's family had suddenly moved out of the country. She had run away from that life because she wanted peace. She wanted normal. But tonight, looking at the locked door, she realized that normal wouldn't save her. She lay down on the bed, curling around her stomach. "Uncle Nico is coming," she whispered to the baby. Downstairs the party was raging. Julian was toasting to his success, unaware that the clock had just started ticking down on his life. He thought he was the shark in the tank. He had no idea the Kraken had just been released. The morning sun hit the Hamptons with a blinding brightness that Julian Thorne found personally offensive. He woke up with a pounding headache, the remnants of the 1982 Margot, and too much cognac swirling in his system. He rolled over. Sienna was already awake, scrolling through her phone, wearing one of his dress shirts. "Your wife is trending," she said, not looking up. "Or at least the party is. Everyone is talking about how graceful I looked. But some people are asking where she went." Julian groaned, sitting up and rubbing his temples. Who cares? They're asking because they love drama. As long as the stock price holds, they can gossip all they want. He got out of bed, feeling the master of his domain. Today was the day he was going to finalize things. He had spoken to his lawyers the previous week. He was bored with Jake. The pregnancy had made her dull and unattractive in his eyes. He wanted the fun, the excitement. He wanted Sienna. But he wanted his heir, too. "I'm going to handle it," Julian said, pulling on a silk robe. He walked down the hallway to the master bedroom where he had locked Jake. He didn't bother knocking. He punched the code into the keypad and shoved the door open. Jake was sitting exactly where he had left her, on the edge of the bed. She was dressed in comfortable leggings and a sweater, her bag packed by her feet. She looked strangely calm. "Good," Julian sneered. "You're packed. Saves me the trouble." "I'm leaving, Julian," Jake said, her voice steady. "Oh, you're leaving all right. But not the way you think." Julian leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "I called my lawyer this morning. We're filing for divorce on the grounds of mental instability. That little display last night, throwing wine, hysterical behavior, it's all documented." Jake stood up, her hand on her belly. "You know that's not what happened." "It's what 50 witnesses saw." Julian smiled cruelly. "And here is the deal, Jake. You are going to sign a full NDA. You will admit to infidelity. I don't care who with. Make someone up. And you will grant me full custody of the child once it's born." Jake's eyes widened. "You want my baby?" "My baby," Julian corrected. "You're just the vessel. You think I'm going to let a Thorne heir be raised in some European backwater by a woman who can't even hold a wine bottle? No. Sienna and I will raise him. You will get a small monthly allowance, and you will go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. If you fight me, I will destroy you. I will bury you in legal fees until you're starving in the street." Sienna appeared behind Julian, holding a green juice, smirking. "Don't worry, Jake. I'll make a great stepmom. I've already picked out a nanny." Jake looked at the clock on the wall. 10 what a gem. 6 hours, she whispered to herself. "What?" Julian snapped. "Nothing," Jake said, a strange, cold smile touching her lips. "I won't sign anything, Julian." Julian's face turned red. He took a step forward, raising his hand. "You stupid Boom! The sound wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the massive, reinforced iron gates at the end of the driveway being ripped off their hinges. Julian froze. What the hell was that? He ran to the window that overlooked the long, winding driveway. His eyes bulged. 3 matte black Mercedes G-Wagons, modified with bull bars and armored plating, were tearing up the pristine lawn. They hadn't waited for the intercom. They had simply driven through the gate. "Who the hell is that?" Sienna screeched, dropping her juice. "Is it the paparazzi?" "Paparazzi drive Priuses, you idiot!" Julian shouted. He grabbed the intercom on the wall. "Marcus, security, stop them! Shoot them if you have to!" But the intercom was dead. There was no static, just silence. Below, The car screeched to a halt in front of the fountain. The doors flew open. Julian expected police. He expected maybe a SWAT team if there had been a misunderstanding. Instead, 10 men stepped out. They were dressed in charcoal grey tactical suits, not military, but high-end private military contractor gear. No logos, no badges, just earpieces and assault rifles held at the low ready. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Then, from the back of the lead vehicle, a man stepped out. He was a giant, at least 6'5", with broad shoulders that strained against a bespoke Italian suit. He had a shaved head and a thick beard that was greying at the chin. He didn't look up at the window. He didn't rush. He buttoned his suit jacket calmly, adjusted his cuffs, and walked toward the front door like he owned the very earth it stood on. Julian felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He turned to Jake. "Who is that?" he demanded. "Who did you call?" Jake picked up her bag. Her trembling had stopped. "You called him a truck driver," she said softly. "You should have checked what he was transporting." Julian Thorne scrambled downstairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a man who solved problems with checks and lawyers, not physical confrontation. He grabbed a golf club from the bag in the hallway, a pathetic weapon against what was outside, but it made him feel slightly less naked. "Stay here," he yelled at Sienna, who was hyperventilating on the stairs. Julian reached the grand foyer just as the front doors exploded inward. They weren't kicked in. A small, precise charge had blown the lock mechanism, swinging the heavy oak doors open with a violent gust of wind. Julian stumbled back, raising the golf club. "Get out! I have cameras! I'm calling the police!" 2 of the tactical operators entered first. They didn't even look at Julian. One of them swept the room with the barrel of his rifle, then gave a curt nod. "Clear." The man from the car walked in. Up close, he was even more terrifying. His face was a map of violence. A jagged scar ran from his ear to his jawline, disappearing into his beard. But his eyes were intelligent, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. He looked around the foyer, taking in the expensive art, the marble floors, and finally, the trembling man in the silk robe holding a 9-iron. "You must be Julian," the man said. His voice was deep, accented with a heavy Dutch-German lilt. It sounded like gravel grinding together. "I'm Julian Thorne. Do you know who I am?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "Get out of my house." The man ignored him. He tapped his earpiece. "Secure the grounds. Nobody leaves. Cut the hard lines. Jam the cell signals." "Roger," a voice crackled in his ear. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Julian took a step forward, swinging the club. The man moved so fast, Julian didn't even register it. One moment the man was standing 5 feet away. The next, his hand was wrapped around Julian's throat. He lifted Julian off the ground as easily as if he were a child. Julian gasped, clawing at the massive hand. His feet dangled 6 inches off the floor. "You are loud," the man said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "I do not like loud noises." He threw Julian. He didn't push him. He threw him. Julian flew across the foyer and crashed into a console table, shattering a Ming vase. He groaned, clutching his ribs, gasping for air. Sienna screamed from the top of the stairs. The man looked up. He assessed her for 1 second, crimson dress, terrified expression, and dismissed her as a non-threat. "Jake!" the man called out. His voice softened instantly. "Where are you, Liebchen?" "I'm here, Nico." Jake appeared at the top of the stairs. She was holding her stomach, tears streaming down her face. The giant's face broke. The mask of the killer fell away, replaced by pure, agonizing concern. He walked to the bottom of the stairs, extending a hand. "Come down. Carefully." Jake walked down, bypassing Sienna, who was pressed against the wall, shaking. When Jake reached the bottom, Nikolai Visser pulled her into a hug that looked like it could crush a bear, but was gentle as a feather. He kissed her forehead. "I am late," he apologized. "Traffic on the LIE is inefficient." "You came," she sobbed into his suit. "I always come." Nikolai pulled back and looked at her. He touched her cheek, then looked at the red stain on the carpet where Julian had fallen. He looked at the bruises on Jake's arm, faint, but visible to a trained eye. Nikolai turned back to Julian. The warmth vanished. The winter returned. Julian was trying to crawl away. "I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested. My friend is the chief of police." Nikolai walked over to a leather armchair and sat down, crossing his legs. He gestured for one of his men to bring a chair for Jake. "Sit, Jake. You should not be standing." "Who are you?" Julian wheezed, pulling himself up to a sitting position. "What do you want? Money? I have money. Take whatever you want." Nikolai laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silver cigarette case. He lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking rule of the Thorne estate. "Money?" Nikolai exhaled a plume of smoke. "Mr. Thorne, my company, Visser Logistics, moves €4 billion worth of cargo across the European borders every year. I do not need your money. I have enough money to buy this Hampton swamp and turn it into a parking lot." Julian blinked. "Logistics? Jake said you were a manager." "I am a manager," Nikolai agreed. "I manage problems. Sometimes I move weapons for governments that cannot be seen moving them. Sometimes I move gold. Sometimes I move people who need to disappear." He leaned forward. "And sometimes I manage little men who think they can hurt my blood." Julian went pale. He suddenly remembered the stories Jake had told him years ago, stories he had ignored. A family business. Import, export. You're the Visser crime family?" Julian whispered. "We prefer independent contractors," Nikolai corrected. He flicked ash onto the Persian rug. "Look," Julian stammered, trying to find his negotiator voice. "This is a domestic dispute. It's a misunderstanding. Jake is emotional. She's pregnant. I was just trying to help her." Nikolai stood up. He walked over to Julian and crouched down so they were eye level. "Jake tells me you made her pour wine for your whore," Nikolai said quietly. Julian flinched. "No, it was a joke. And then you locked her in a room. It was for her safety. And then," Nikolai's voice dropped an octave, "you told her she exists because you allow it." Julian said nothing. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. "You have a god complex, Julian," Nikolai said. "You think you are the apex predator because you have a black Amex card. But you are not a wolf. You are just a sheep with a lot of wool." Nikolai stood up and snapped his fingers. Two of his tactical men stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the arms and hauling him up. "What are you doing? Where are you taking me?" Julian screamed, thrashing. "To the dining room," Nikolai said, adjusting his cuffs. "I am hungry, and we have a lot of drinking to do." He turned to Sienna on the stairs. She jumped. "You too, Fräulein," Nikolai said coldly. "You are the guest of honor." "I didn't do anything," Sienna wailed. "I'm just his girlfriend." "You held the glass," Nikolai said. "That makes you part of the toast." As Julian was dragged kicking and screaming toward the dining room, he looked back at Jake. She hadn't moved. She sat in the chair, her hand on her belly, watching him with eyes that were no longer afraid. She was watching the scales balance. The dining room of the Thorne estate was designed to intimidate. A 20-foot mahogany table, imported from a French monastery, sat beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with cherubs. Usually, Julian sat at the head, looking down the long expanse at his guests. Today, Julian was on his knees. Nikolai sat at the head of the table. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a shoulder holster housing a suppressed pistol. He looked entirely at ease, slicing an apple with a small, sharp fruit knife. Jake sat to his right, wrapped in a cashmere blanket one of the tactical team members had found for her. A glass of water and a plate of fresh fruit sat before her. She wasn't eating. She was watching. Sienna stood by the sideboard, shivering. Her mascara was running, creating black streaks down her face that matched the ruin of her crimson dress. Two of Nikolai's men stood behind her, silent as statues. The architecture is gaudy, Nikolai commented, popping a slice of apple into his mouth. New money screams. Old money whispers. This house is screaming. Please, Julian begged. His knees were aching against the hard parquet floor. My legs are cramping. Can I stand up? Did you let Jake sit when her ankles were swollen? Nikolai asked without looking up. Julian faltered. Then you stay. Nikolai gestured with the knife. Now, let's talk about wine. You mentioned earlier, before you started crying, that the bottle Jake dropped was worth $3,000. It was a 82 Margot, Julian whispered. It's rare. Rare, Nikolai repeated. He snapped his fingers. Two of his men entered from the kitchen carrying wooden crates. They set them down on the table with a heavy thud. Julian's eyes widened. That's my private reserve. Those are Romani Conti. Those are priceless. Nothing is priceless, Nikolai said. Everything has a cost. You taught Jake the cost of a stain. Now, I will teach you the cost of arrogance. Nikolai picked up a bottle. It was a 1945 Mouton Rothschild, a bottle worth more than most cars. Open it, Nikolai commanded, sliding the bottle across the long table. It spun and stopped inches from Julian's nose. Julian's hands shook as he reached for the corkscrew one of the guards tossed at him. You want me to open it? To drink? To open, Nikolai corrected. Julian struggled with the cork. His sweat dripped onto the label. He finally popped it with a soft thwack. The aroma filled the room, rich, earthy, expensive. Pour, Nikolai said. Into a glass? Julian asked, looking for a decanter. No, Nikolai pointed to Sienna, on her. The room went dead silent. Sienna let out a strangled sob. Julian, no, don't you dare! Julian looked from the bottle to the gun under Nikolai's arm. He looked at Sienna, the woman he had humiliated his wife for. I said, pour. Nikolai's voice hardened. Jake spilled by accident. You will spill with purpose. You wanted a mistress soaked in luxury. Make it happen. Please, Julian wept. This is insane. This is a $60,000 bottle. And that, Nikolai pointed at Jake, is my sister. Do you think your bottle is worth more than her tears? Nikolai picked up the fruit knife and drove it into the mahogany table. It stuck there, quivering. Julian scrambled up, bottle in hand. He walked over to Sienna. I'm sorry, Julian whispered to her. He's crazy. I have to. I hate you, Sienna shrieked, trying to back away, but the guards held her firm. Julian tipped the bottle. The dark, ruby liquid poured out, splashing over Sienna's hair, her face, her dress. It was a grotesque reenactment of the night before. The smell of vintage wine became overpowering, sickening. Sienna screamed and cried as the cold liquid drenched her. Julian continued until the bottle was empty. He stood there, holding the empty glass vessel, broken. Again, Nikolai said. What? Julian turned. There are 12 bottles in that crate, Nikolai said calmly. We are just getting started. You like wine so much, Julian. Today, you will drown in it. For the next hour, the dining room became a theater of absurdity. Julian was forced to uncork bottle after bottle of the world's finest wines, Petrus, Screaming Eagle, Lafitte, and pour them out. Sometimes on the floor, sometimes on his own expensive tuxedo, sometimes just down the drain of a bucket brought for the occasion. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of liquid assets were destroyed while Jake watched. It wasn't about the wine. It was about stripping away the symbol of Julian's status. He defined himself by these things. Nikolai was showing him that his gods were liquid, and they could be poured away in an instant. When the last bottle was empty, the room smelled like a brewery floor. Julian was panting, his hands purple from the wine stains. Sienna was sobbing quietly in the corner, a sticky, red mess. "Are we done?" Julian rasped. "You've made your point. You've destroyed my collection." "The wine was just the appetizer," Nikolai said, standing up. He wiped his hands on a napkin. "Now, we discuss the main course. Business?" He walked over to a large briefcase his men had brought in. He opened it and pulled out a laptop. "Sit," Nikolai ordered Julian. Julian collapsed into a chair, exhausted. "What now? You want a wire transfer? Is that it?" "I told you, I do not want your money," Nikolai said, typing on the keyboard. "But I do want to know. How is the Clean Water Initiative doing?" Julian froze. His blood ran cold, colder than the wine. "I don't know what you mean," Julian stammered. "It's a charity." "It is a laundromat," Nikolai said, turning the laptop screen toward Julian. "You take donations, you funnel them through shell companies in the Caymans, and you use the money to prop up your failing tech stocks. It is a Ponzi scheme, Julian. And you are not even good at it." Julian stared at the screen. It displayed his private ledger, the one he kept on an encrypted server. How did you get this?" "My cybersecurity team makes the NSA look like a high school computer club," Nikolai said. "We have been inside your system since Jake called me. We have everything. The fake invoices, the bribes to the zoning board, the emails where you admit to defrauding investors." Nikolai hit a key. A progress bar appeared on the screen. "What are you doing?" Julian screamed, lunging for the laptop. A guard slammed Julian's head into the table. "I am hitting send," Nikolai said pleasantly. "To the SEC, to the FBI, to the IRS, and just for fun to the New York Times tip line." "No," Julian howled. "You can't. That's my life. You'll send me to prison." "You sent yourself to prison when you decided to be a criminal," Nikolai said. "I am just the courier." The atmosphere in the room shifted from physical danger to existential dread. Julian realized that the man in front of him wasn't just a thug who broke knees. He was an executioner who ended lives without firing a shot. "You can stop it," Julian pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll give Jake half. I'll give her everything." "Jake already has everything she needs," Nikolai said. "She has her family. She has her dignity." Nikolai walked over to Jake. "Are you ready to go, Liebchen?" Jake stood up. She looked at Julian, broken, stained, weeping over a laptop. She felt a strange lightness. The fear was gone. "Yes, Nico, I'm ready." "Wait!" Julian grabbed the edge of the table. "You can't leave me like this. The police are coming. The reporters are coming." "Yes," Nikolai nodded. "They will be here soon. The police to arrest you for fraud, and the reporters to take pictures of the fallen billionaire. It will be quite the show. I suggest you go shower. You smell like bad decisions." Nikolai offered his arm to his sister. They began to walk out of the dining room. "Sienna!" Julian shouted. "Help me! Call your father!" Sienna looked up. She was shivering, wrapped in a tablecloth. She looked at Julian with pure loathing. "You're broke," she spat. "And you're going to jail. Don't talk to me." She stood up and ran past Nikolai, fleeing the house, barefoot and covered in wine. She knew when a ship was sinking. Nikolai stopped at the door and turned back to Julian one last time. "Oh, I forgot," Nikolai said. "The house." "What about the house?" Julian whispered. "I bought the mortgage note this morning," Nikolai said casually. "From your bank. They were very eager to sell once I showed them your credit rating was about to crash. Technically, you are trespassing." He checked his watch. "You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises before I have my men throw you out the front gate. And Julian?" "What?" "If you ever mention Jake's name, if you ever look for the child, if you ever even think about her, I will not come with wine next time." Nikolai patted his holster. "I will come with tools." Julian Thorne sat alone in the great dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of his ego. The smell of the wine was nauseating. He heard the heavy front door close. He heard the engines of the G-Wagon start up. He looked at his phone. It was buzzing. Caller ID, FBI Special Agent Miller. Julian didn't answer. He stared at the puddle of wine on the floor. In the reflection, he saw a man who had everything, and lost it all because he didn't know the value of the woman standing next to him. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. Jake stepped into the back of the SUV, the leather seat soft and welcoming. Nikolai slid in beside her. "Where are we going?" Jake asked as the convoy began to move, rolling over the crushed iron gates. "To the airstrip," Nikolai said. "We are going home, to Europe. Mom has already set up the nursery. She is arguing with Dad about the color of the crib." Jake smiled, a real smile. "Is Dad angry?" "That you left?" "No. That you didn't call sooner?" "Yes. He wanted to come with me, but I told him his knees aren't what they used to be. He is currently preparing a feast for your return." Jake looked out the window. The Hamptons were fading away. The mansions, the status, the cruelty. It was all disappearing in the rearview mirror. "Nico." "Yes?" "Thank you." Nikolai took her hand. His hand, so capable of violence, was incredibly gentle. "Family is not something you leave behind, Jake. It is the army that stands behind you." The convoy turned onto the highway, speeding toward the airport. Back at the estate, the flashing lights of police cruisers were just becoming visible at the end of the driveway. The sirens wailed, a song of justice long overdue. Julian Thorne was about to learn that in the real world, actions have consequences, and mistresses don't pour wine for men in handcuffs. But for Jake, the nightmare was over. The video was ending, but her life was just beginning. The fall of Julian Thorne was not a gentle slide. It was a cliff dive. 3 months had passed since the night of the wine. Julian was currently being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center while awaiting trial. The charges were a laundry list of white-collar nightmares: wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and money laundering. Nikolai had been thorough. He hadn't just leaked the documents, he had organized them, highlighted them, and practically gift-wrapped them for the federal prosecutor. But Julian was a narcissist, and narcissists do not accept defeat. They only plot revenge. The prison was a stark contrast to his Hamptons estate. The air smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies. His suite was an 8-10 cell he shared with a man named Marcus, who was in for armed robbery and snored like a chainsaw. Julian sat on his bunk, staring at the concrete wall. He had one card left to play. Nikolai had found the accounts in the Caymans. He had found the shell companies in Panama. But he hadn't found the crypto cold storage. Years ago, Julian had bought a physical hard drive containing $10 million in Bitcoin. He had buried it in a safety deposit box in a small, non-chain bank in New Jersey, under the name of a deceased childhood friend. It was his Apocalypse Fund. He didn't want to use it to flee. He wanted to use it to hurt. "Attorney visit," a guard grunted, banging on the bars. Julian straightened his orange jumpsuit. His lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Henderson, because all his high-powered lawyers had dropped him when the checks bounced, was useless. But Julian didn't need him for legal advice. He needed him as a mule. In the visitation room, Julian leaned close to the plexiglass. "Did you find him?" Julian whispered. Henderson looked nervous. He was a sweaty, balding man who clearly regretted taking this high-profile case. "Julian, listen. The plea deal they're offering." "Forget the plea deal," Julian hissed. "Did you find the man I told you about?" Henderson looked around, terrified. I spoke to a guy. He says he knows people in Europe. But Julian, this is crazy. If they catch you soliciting, they won't catch me if you shut up," Julian snapped. "I'm going to give you coordinates. There's a key. You get the drive, you pay the man. The job is simple. I want Jake hurt. I don't care about the brother. He's too hard to get to. But Jake? She's soft. She's vulnerable." Julian's eyes burned with a maniacal light. "I want the baby gone. I want her to feel what it's like to lose everything." Henderson wiped sweat from his forehead. "The guy, he said he needs half up front. He's a professional. He operates out of Amsterdam." "Good," Julian smiled, a smile that was missing a tooth, courtesy of a disagreement in the shower block last week. "The Vissers think they are the kings of Europe. Let's see how they handle a ghost." 1 week later, the Visser estate, near the German-Dutch border. The Visser family home was not a house. It was a fortress disguised as a chateau. Nestled in a dense forest, it was surrounded by high stone walls and patrolled by men with German shepherds. Jake sat in the garden, rocking a cradle. The air was fresh, smelling of pine and rain. Inside the cradle, baby Lucas was sleeping soundly. He was 3 months old, with his mother's eyes, and, thankfully, none of his father's temperament. Jake looked healthy. The stress lines were gone. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair loose. She looked like the art student she had been before New York crushed her. "He sleeps well," a deep voice rumbled. Jake looked up. An older man stood there. He was massive, even bigger than Nikolai, though age had stooped his shoulders slightly. He had a thick white mustache and hands that looked like they had been carved from oak. This was Victor Visser, the patriarch, the man Julian had called a peasant. "He does, Papa," Jake smiled. "He likes the fresh air." Victor sat on the stone bench next to her. He watched the baby with an intensity that belied his reputation. To the world, Victor Visser was a myth, a man who controlled shipping lanes from Rotterdam to Hamburg, a man who had stared down the Russian mob in the 90s and won. To Jake, he was just Papa. "Nikolai tells me the American is restless," Victor said, his voice a low growl. Jake's smile faded slightly. "Julian?" "He tries to reach out from his cage," Victor said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black hard drive. Jake froze. "What is that?" $10 million in Bitcoin, Victor said, tossing it in his hand like a toy. "Julian tried to hire a hitman in Amsterdam. He wanted an accident for you and the boy." Jake clutched the side of the cradle, her knuckles turning white. "He tried to kill us? From prison?" "He tried," Victor corrected. "But Julian makes a mistake. He hires a professional in Amsterdam. He does not know that there is no crime in Amsterdam that happens without my permission." Victor's eyes hardened. "The hitman he hired works for me." His lawyer. He was very easily persuaded to hand this over once we showed him photos of his own family. Jake felt a wave of nausea. Even locked away, Julian was pure poison. "What will you do?" Jake asked. "Will you kill him?" Victor laughed softly. Kill him. No, Liebchen. Death is too easy. Death is silence. Julian deserves noise. Victor stood up. He signaled to the house. Nikolai walked out, holding a phone. It is time, Nikolai said. Time for what? Jake asked. To say goodbye, Nikolai said. We arranged a video call. Special privileges. The warden owes us a favor. Nikolai handed Jake an iPad. On the screen, Julian appeared. He was sitting in a small grey room, handcuffed to a table. He looked smug. He was expecting his lawyer to tell him the job was done. When he saw Jake's face on the screen, his smugness vanished. Jake? Julian gasped. How? Hello, Julian, Jake said. Her voice was strong. She angled the camera so he could see the garden, the high walls, and the baby sleeping peacefully. You, Julian stammered. You should be dead? Victor's face appeared in the frame next to Jake. Julian went pale. He had never seen Victor Visser, but he knew instinctively who this was. The sheer presence of the man translated even through a pixelated screen. You hired a contractor in my city, boy, Victor said. You paid him with this. Victor held up the hard drive to the camera. Julian screamed, a primal, broken sound. That's mine! That's my money! It was your money, Victor said. Now it is a donation. We have just transferred the entire balance to a charity, a real charity, a shelter for battered women in New York. In your name. Isn't that generous of you? No! Julian thrashed against his cuffs. You can't do this. That was my freedom. You have no freedom, Nikolai's voice cut in. And now you have no secrets. We also recorded your conversation with the lawyer. We sent the audio to the district attorney. Soliciting murder of a federal witness? That adds 20 years to your sentence, Julian. You're going to die in that concrete box. Julian began to weep. Not the fake tears he used for the press, but real, terrified tears. He realized, finally, the magnitude of his error. He hadn't just kicked a dog. He had walked into a wolf's den wearing a stake necklace. Jake, please, Julian begged, looking at the screen. Tell them to stop. I'm the father of your child. Jake looked at the man on the screen. She remembered the wine on her dress. She remembered the locked door. She remembered the way he looked at her like she was furniture. She looked down at Lucas. You are not a father, Julian, Jake said softly. You are just a donor. She reached out and pressed the red button. The screen goes black. Back in the garden, the silence returned. Peaceful. Absolute. Victor put a heavy hand on Jake's shoulder. It is done. The American ghost is exorcised. Thank you, Papa, Jake whispered. Come, Victor said. Dinner is ready. Nikolai made schnitzel, and I believe there is a bottle of wine. A cheap one. €5. Jake laughed. That sounds perfect. She picked up her son and walked back toward the fortress, leaving the iPad on the bench. The story of Julian Thorne was over, buried under the weight of his own hubris. But the story of Jake Visser, the mother, the survivor, the daughter of the wolf, was just beginning. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good revenge drama. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have a new story dropping next week about a cheating husband who didn't realize his wife owned the company he worked for. You do not want to miss that. Thanks for watching, and remember, treat people with kindness, or their brother might just be a logistics manager. See you in the next one.